who is the education consultant from Child Hong Kong as well. Hi, Lisa.
Hello.
Hi. So welcome you both. Before the webinar starts, so please mute your microphone, and you are welcome to ask a question using the chat box during the presentation. We will record the session, and you may choose to turn off your camera. So please go to Chatteris website to learn more about the collaboration between North Anglia and Chatteris. So maybe now it's time to start the scaffolding in the classroom to avoid cognitive overload webinar. So Dr. Lexi and Lisa, please.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
We're really glad to be here today for to be able to share with you some of our experience and knowledge around cognitive overload and working memory, and really, really happy to be able to support Chatteris, which is an amazing organization, as well as North Anglia, because it's such a great collaboration together. So my name is Lisa, and I'm an educational consultant and educational assessor. I've been in education for the last 25 years. My background is in special educational needs, and I've been in school leadership and school principal, and now we are part of Child. Lexi?
I'm Dr. Lexi Sanderson, and I'm the charter psychologist on the team. And I've been working with children with neurodiversities for well over 20 years in research. And I think our uniqueness is the fact that we've come together from different disciplines in order to not just support the child with the learning difference, but we sort of advocate, as you can see on our slides, building that team around the child. So we're working with the children, with the teachers, getting them involved, parents, siblings, as well as schools to understand the child as a whole and to support and build that team around the child.
Yeah.
And we're interested in learning differences, but also neurodiversities. We like the term sort of neurodiversity to understand these differences, don't we?
Yeah. And we tend to follow a strength-based model. So we see neurodiversity as a strength that could lead to competitive advantages, because there's people with very unique skills. So it's a very inclusive team and a very inclusive practice. And this is why as educators, it's really important for us all to understand about cognitive load and working memory. Yeah. So we'll chat our way through this webinar with you, and please do put questions into the chat so that we can ask questions. I've just realized that we have 2 Jamboards, and I need to share the link with you somehow. So I'll try and figure that out. If we don't, no problem. We will talk our way through it and see what we can do. Unless the Chatteris team might be able to help share some of that with the links. Oh, there we go. We can do it through here. Anyway, okay, we're ready to begin. Yeah. So to begin with, first of all, oh, did I do the aims? Oh, there they are. Sorry. Okay.
Okay, so really today we're going to look at what cognitive overload is and how that relates to working memory. And being the psychologist, I'm going to talk a little bit about memory and a little bit about theory, because we need to understand the underlying principles of memory in order to support these children. We're then going to go on to recognizing working memory deficits in children, really understanding the characteristics and how you can spot them within your classroom. And then also reflect, so how can we support these children in the classroom and also online now as well. So we'll give you a few tips and tricks on how to support these children, not just in the classroom, but also online as we go through.
Okay, good. So we are going to try to practice what we preach and avoid cognitive overload from our webinar. So one strategy that I think most educators, you'll all know about, is the KWL strategy. So it's what we know, what we want to know, and what we learn. And we really advocate doing this to preload the learning or the unit that's going to be coming up next. Why? Because it accesses our prior knowledge and it just hooks into what is already in our students' long-term memory. So we'll just jump over to here. I think the link is not in the top box. So I'm going to just see if I can.
If you just copy.
Let me just copy this link for you and I'll see if I can get it into our chat box. Okay, so, oh, someone's already done it there. Okay, there we go. So if you can open up that link, let's see if we can make this happen. What we really want you to try to do is to think about how we could use this KWL. So what do you already know about working memory? And what do you want to know about working memory? And then at the end, you can always go back to write down what have you learned. So again, KWL is a fantastic tool to use before any new learning to access the prior learning that's taken place. So let's see if we can get some of you to do some post-it notes. So the post-it notes are just here, a sticky note. So you click on the sticky note and then you can add, what do you already know about working memory? What do you already know about cognitive load? And then what would you like to learn? So we'll give you just about 1 minute to do that. I can see some new sticky notes. So I want to know if working memory capacity changes over time.
We are going to cover that actually.
Okay, anybody else? I know that working memory capacity differs in different people. Yes. Has everybody got that link? I can see people moving. Okay, we'll leave you to do some more and we'll, oh, here we are. Oh gosh, look at all of them.
They're all on top of each other.
Oh, that's why. Oh, well done. Okay, so what do we already know? Hold new information very briefly.
Yeah.
Okay. Working memory can be affected by multiple factors: stress, behavioral differences, learning differences. Absolutely. I want to know how we use our working memory in the classroom, or how it works in the classroom. I want to know what can affect working memory capacity. Yep, we'll talk about that. Is working memory trainable? That's a very good question, and it's also debatable.
Yeah.
I'd like to learn how you can adjust for different working memory capacity while teaching, strategies to help students. Brilliant. Okay, great. That's a really great start. So again, you can see how useful this tool can be for any new topic that you're going to do. Oh, that's a nice one. I know that most people can only hold around 7 objects in their working memory.
And we might just do a little test on that as well.
Yes, you'll all be tested. You're going to be put to the test. Okay, great. So, Lexi.
Okay, so we're going to sort of do a little bit of theory behind what is cognitive load and what is working memory. Now, cognitive load, cognitive just means thinking, and load is just about the amount of information. So essentially what we're talking about here is the amount of information that you can hold in your working memory at one time. Now, not all cognitive load is bad. We need to be challenged in order to learn. But where it becomes a problem is when that cognitive load, that amount of information, becomes too much for us to process. And if it becomes too much, it's lost. And then we have to start again. So I'm going to, I know this, as a psychologist, I love brains, and I try and get this into everything that I do. So I'll make it very simple. But essentially, the way in which memory works is all about encoding. We've got to get the information into our working memory in the first place. We then have to store it within our long-term memory, and then we have to get that information out again. Now, learning is that active dialogue between our working memory and our long-term memory. Now, our working memory is in the prefrontal cortex, which is at the front of our brain, and it deals with all our higher order thinking. It deals with those complex cognitive processes. Our long-term memory, there are different areas within our brain for our long-term memory, but essentially when we learn, we are linking and connecting information from our working memory to our long-term memory. So that's why scaffolding is so important, so we can preload information. So we've got something to connect to it, and that helps children learn. Now, we know that particularly for children who have neurodiversities and an impairment in reading, or what we call dyslexia, they have an impairment in their working memory. It is not as good as a neurotypical child. We also know that another predictor of dyslexia is this rapid automatic naming. These children can't access quickly the information stored in their long-term memory and bring it into their working memory. So we need to understand the brain and the way in which it works in order to support these children with working memory deficits.
And I think it's really important as we move through this webinar, just to try to hold on to these concepts and then think about yourself in your classroom environments and what would that look like? So, you know, what would that look like in a busy classroom if we know, for example, that that dialogue needs to take place between what's being processed and what's already in the brain.
Yeah.
And so it's important to think about that as we go through the webinar.
Okay, so this is, and I'm going to go through this very quickly. It's a model of memory. It's Baddeley and Hitch's model of memory. And if you've done an undergrad in psychology, you'll know about this. Now, when I was actually at university, we didn't understand the concept of working memory. This has been added in the past sort of 15, 20 years. So we know there is a lot of research out there, but we also know we need to understand it in order to support teachers. So what's happening in your classroom is this bit here. It is what we see and what we hear, and those children are experiencing information coming in through their eyes and their ears. But it's also about how we taste and how we feel as well. And sometimes we need to make things concrete in order for children to learn. We need to model in order for children to learn. But to get information into that working memory in the first place, we need to attend to it. If Lisa's poking me or flicking elastic bands at me, that information isn't going to go into that working memory in the first place. And then we need to transfer it to our long-term memory. So really, when we talk about working memory and short-term memory in particular, we sometimes think of them as the same thing. Then they are very similar, but they're not the same. So we're going to talk about the differences, and we're going to do a little experiment to show you what the differences are. But essentially, our short-term memory and our working memory has a very limited capacity. We're talking about 7 pieces of information plus or minus 2. And if you think about children who have neurodiversities, they could only be remembering 5 pieces of information, whereas other children who maybe are more on the gifted and talented side of things will be able to hold 9 pieces of information. That is a big difference. And then again, the difference in working memory with your capacity to hold what you see, that visual information, might be very different from your capacity from what you hear. So working memory does change, and of course we'll talk about how stress affects our working memory as we go through. So should we try a little test of short-term memory?
Yeah, short-term memory. I think also you just made me think of something as well in terms of what I like to think about in terms of capacity is like a little post-it note.
Yes.
And it's imagining that, you know, I use post-it, I write everywhere. I use post-it notes all the time to write my ideas. But, you know, eventually you're going to run out of space on that one post-it note. And that's a little bit like that working memory capacity, isn't it? Okay, so no pens allowed, no papers allowed. We are going to do what's called a forward digit span. And this is a subtest that is used on some of the assessment tools that are used in order to test short-term memory. So we're just going to do this for fun to see how many digits you can remember. Now with children or with adults, when it starts with only a few digits at a time, and then the sequence builds over time just to see how many numbers can be recalled in terms of a long sequence. But because we know that all of your working memories are just so strong, we're going to start at 7. So the idea is then I'm going to say the numbers. Now I will sound a little bit robotic and a little bit neutral in terms of my voice, because what we don't want to happen is we don't want our brains and other parts of our brains to be able to cling on to the information. For example, we know that anything that's musical or rhythmic, that's another part of our brain that latches onto that and helps us to remember. So we're going to try to make this about pure short-term memory. So I will say the digits and then we'll stop and you try to say the digits back, although we can't hear you. We will then tell you what the digits are again, just to see. If you'd like to write them down after we finish the whole sequence of numbers, you can. Okay, so this would be a typical short-term memory subtest. So here are the numbers. 4, 6, 8, 9, 3, 7, 4. And then we would ask the student or the child to be able to recall those digits. So see if you can write down those. We can only do it once. I'll give you a second. You can give it a go on the chat box if you'd like to try and say your answers. Okay, so the 7 digits that I said were 4, 6, 8, 9, 3, 7, 4. And sometimes what we tend to see students do, particularly those, it's a bit of a clue, isn't it? A behavioral clue, is that if they have a poor short-term working memory, what sometimes happens is that there's a lot of recall, verbal recall. So students sometimes will say 4, 4, 4, 6, 6, 6, 8, 8, 8, until they do the whole sequence. But that in itself is data and information for us to know that that person or that individual is putting in strategies because the short-term memory is not there. And that is a great strategy to have. In order to get information from our short-term memory into our long-term memory, we do need to rehearse it before we can write it down. Yeah. Now, working memory, on the other hand, is how we can hold on to that information whilst we do something else, whilst we manipulate some other part of information. And this is something that we do all the time within the classroom. So an example of working memory is if we're going to only take 5 digits this time. If we take the first 5 digits of that number we just gave you, working memory has to hold those first 5 digits, and then I'm going to ask you to add one number, so increase it in size by 1 for each of the digits. So a 9 would now become a 10. So if I said to you 4, 6, 8, 9, 3, you need to hold on to that number whilst you add another, increase it in size. It's a very difficult task. So essentially what you're doing is that working memory, or a memory in action. So the number you should have is 5, 7, 9, 10, 4, which I couldn't hold on to at all and manipulate. But that is a really good example. And again, if we're thinking around what that might look like in day-to-day life, I think about things like back in my childhood, when the phone would ring and I'd have to pick up the phone and take down a message. Yeah. Perhaps I was recording a phone number that somebody was leaving me, and maybe I was distracted during that and the phone number was gone again and I couldn't recall it. So I was doing many things and having to manipulate the information at a time. And then one classic one nowadays is, of course, we've got technology that is doing these things for us. So I couldn't tell you what my husband's phone number is right now because I don't need to. The technology is doing it. Or the sat nav. The sat nav is a great example, again, isn't it? In days gone by, when none of us had that technology, we were able to have to hold on to drive, hold on to the street names, with the direction, picture it in our minds. And these days with navigation systems, that's just gone. That load has been reduced tremendously. So it's really interesting to see how applicable it is in day-to-day life. Yeah, absolutely. And then that is just an auditory working memory. When we're looking at children as well, we'll also look at their visual working memory. Yeah. Okay, so on to some sort of theory behind what cognitive load looks like, cognitive being the way in which we think and the amount of information. And we can break this down into 3 areas: the intrinsic load, the germane load, and the extrinsic load. Now, the intrinsic load is all about the complexity of the subject that you are teaching. Children have no control over this. It is all up to you as a teacher to control that complexity of information. And essentially, it is that differentiation of learning, making it as simple as you can for those children who have working memory issues, but maybe making it a little bit more complex in the way in which you want the child to learn for those children who are slightly more able. When we're talking about the germane load, this is all about the child. It's about how they understand the concept that you're talking about, how they process that information. And again, it's about how they learn through schemas and connecting ideas from what you're talking about, their new information in their working memory, and how they can link that to
stuff they know already in their long-term memory. So this is where the scaffolding comes in and where the preloading comes in. And then we can talk about extrinsic load, that complexity of everything that is going on, controlled by the teacher, and what is happening outside. So it's about that classroom, that's about the noise, it's about the person who sat next to them. And now online, it's about how many different platforms they're using and how many clicks that they need to do to get to the information that they need. So really what we're talking about is simplifying the intrinsic load to increase the learning or the germane load and to reduce that extrinsic load. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So one little example would be if we're learning the names of the planets in our solar system. You as a teacher need to think about the complexity of the information that you are delivering and how you can simplify that for children who have working memory issues, so that their germane load, the way in which they're processing information, is the best it can be. So again, this might be preloading, it might be using word maps, it might be scaffolding and building those blocks, and it might be connecting to other subjects that they already know. So we're increasing the amount of information and the ease in which they can learn. And then again, it's about reducing that extrinsic load. Like, should we show them pictures of the classroom?
So yeah, so if we just think about what our classroom settings might look like. Now I remember I did Teachers College back in the 90s, and I remember at the time it was all about your classrooms being bright and beautiful and bold. And like this is a perfect example of this image here. So, you know, lots of colors, lots of work on display, children being able to, you know, to interact, move about. Those are days gone by, of course. And, you know, many adults in the room, and you can just see it captures a real kind of learning environment, a real zone of energy and activity. Now, the thing about this, of course, and since, you know, the last sort of 20 years of looking at working memory and cognitive load research, is that, you know, are there parts of that classroom environment? Is there too much? Could there be distractions there for children who might struggle or have difficulties with their working memories? So although those are lots of visuals that could be helpful towards children's learning, I think it's about striking a balance, isn't it? And that's what we were talking about a little bit before about the extrinsic load. It's like, what can you control as the adult in the classroom, as the teacher, in terms of what those distractors might look like for other students. And again, with working memory, one important principle to remember is that if the information is lost, the way the working memory works is that it's gone and you have to start again. So again, sometimes classrooms that are able to work with a bit of silence and calm might support pupils, you know, to be able to manage to process all that information that they have to process during their learning. So just have a think as we come to when we talk about strategies that you could put into place, even thinking about environmental strategies. I was just thinking, Lexi, about the germane load. Would it also, we talked about schemas, that would also be their experiences, isn't it? So linking to their experiences, their prior knowledge, all of those things are just the way that we started this presentation, isn't it? With that sort of knowledge that they have before. These things are really important to anchor because it elicits from the memory the experiences the child has. So distractions in the home, that's another one too. There's going to be, you know, many children who are at their homes where either they might have limited space to be able to work. So they're going to have to find the ideal space where the children are going to work, but it could be that there are family members who are going about their daily lives around them that can be distractors for students learning. Like Lexi said, again, it's really important to think about how many platforms that we are asking our children to attend to. Some students that will have working memory difficulties, like we said before, you're holding onto information while having to manipulate. So, you know, if as a teacher, we're giving instructions to the students at the same time that they're having to follow the instruction to open a new platform, or they've got to respond to something on another platform, then it's thinking about how does all that fit? How does all that come together so that these students who might have working memory difficulties are able to be successful at what they're doing, isn't it?
And we'll give you a few more tips and tricks as we go through. But I also think it's important to say, particularly at home and when we're online, is about self-regulation of these children at home, and they can't self-regulate themselves for an entire lesson. So it's about how you can get that salient information across, how they can share that information at that time, so they're not holding all that information in their working memory, and so they know that they can talk to you and they don't have to self-regulate all the time, and that information is then being processed rather than sort of stacking up in their working memory and then lost. So we will talk about a little bit about the self-regulation as they go through.
I'm just wondering if we'll just check quickly and see if we've missed any questions. 1 second. Everybody's doing their digits fantastic. Okay, brilliant. Okay, do ask questions because we can come back to them afterwards. Okay, so working memory and its overlaps. So I think one thing that actually might be interesting from Lexi is just to understand how this working memory deficit isn't yet a diagnosis. Is that important to talk about, I think?
It's not within the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, so you won't get a disorder of working memory, but we do see in so many children with neurodiversities or learning differences, as we like to call them, working memory deficits. Particularly in children, we now call it specific learning disorders, and you can have an impairment in reading, in writing, or in maths, so dyslexia, dysgraphia, and dyscalculia. And if we think about these children within the classroom, we really need to support their working memory and understand their deficits in order to understand how we can, or how they learn, really. So do you want to give an example of dysgraphia?
So just thinking sort of with dysgraphia, for example, or actually any of the dyscalculia or dyslexia, with a specific impairment, for example, in the reading or writing. If we think about giving a task that most of us will do in our classrooms, a writing task, and even it's a news account, it's a reportage, it's an explanation, any type of writing that we've asked our students to do. Well, we have to think about writing as a hierarchy. And I know that we all know this, but it's a hierarchy of skills that's involved in actually putting your written expression, putting your ideas on paper. And what tends to happen for students who've got working memory difficulties, particularly with written impairment or dyslexia, is that so much energy is having to go onto the spelling of words because of their working memory difficulties. They just cannot hold on to the accuracy and the correct spellings of words. And we know the English language is particularly challenging when it comes to different graphemes and different combinations of letters. So there's a lot of energy that's going into, and a lot of mental effort that's going into just trying to retain spellings, which might mean that everything else in the hierarchy of writing just falls away to the wayside. So, we know that there's ideation, there's thinking about ideas. We know that writing involves mechanics of writing, even the handwriting. Oh my goodness, how do I form my letters that way again? It could be things like grammar, punctuation, and you tend to see within that whole writing hierarchy that things will just fall to the wayside, particularly children with working memory difficulties. They won't be able to remember the punctuation. They won't be able to hold on to the ideas so that they've got a flow and a sequence and an organization to their passage and to their written expression. So again, this sort of hierarchy, what's involved in the writing expression or expressive writing, is a really good example of where working memory can have a really direct impact. So what you tend to find with a dyslexia, for example, is you might find a child who's got brilliant ideas and can share verbally those ideas with you, but the minute it comes to writing on paper, those ideas are lost. And it could be because their mental focus and effort is going towards only one thing at a time.
So what you'll see in the classroom is a discrepancy between what they actually can do and their output. And that is another trigger, isn't it, to understanding working memory difficulties. And even if you think about maths, and this is where my working memory goes, like looking at a maths question, holding on to those tens whilst you manipulate units, it's something very basic, but you will see that children really struggle with that. Or they might know their times tables one day, but like trying to get that information back into that working memory, that link is gone. And you think, well, you knew that yesterday.
Yes.
So, think about ways in which and the amount of information
Yes.
that they can record as well.
Yes, and I think one of the things that we do a lot in the classrooms is we do mental maths tests, and don't we? And we expect sort of very quick processing of mental maths, and sometimes that could be a real deterrent for students with working memory difficulties. If, for like Lexi said, if you've got your short-term memory that's able to help you to do, single-digit multiplication. So I know 3 times 2 is 6. And then the teacher might say, okay, well, what's 33 times 16? That's completely different. It might mean that they still know their tens and units, and they still know how to do their simple multiplications. But the fact is that's a working memory task. It's having to hold on to the results from the multiplication, but then also manipulate it. They've got to then hold on to it, add it into the tens column, et cetera, et cetera. So these are all just very routine, exercises or expectations that we'd have of all of our students in the classrooms. But it's really about thinking reflectively about, oh, right, okay, now I know this about working memory. I wonder what that might look like when I plan this activity.
So 2 passions of mine, ADHD and autism. If we look at ADHD is a disorder of executive functioning. And part of our executive functioning is our working memory. We know that children with ADHD just cannot hold and manipulate information within their working memory. They really do have a deficit in working memory. It's a predictor of ADHD. And then autism, there's lots of research, huge meta-analysis on the deficits of working memory in children with autism. And I think both with ADHD and autism, what is interesting is it's far more of visual working memory. They have great visual working memory, but poor auditory working memories. And particularly with specific learning disorders, you can have different abilities within these groups. So some of them might have great visual working memories and can remember where something is on the page, but you ask them to hold information in instructions in verbal form and they can't do it. And then coming back to one of the questions, there are a lot of different areas that impact our working memory: high blood pressure, stress, anxiety, depression. If we're ruminating on a particular issue, we are taking up valuable working memory space, and this reduces our working memory. And this has a big impact. And it could just be within subjects. You might have a better working memory in English than you do in maths because of the stress related to your anxiety of maths. And again, it does change as we get older.
And
a bit of a curve.
Yes, and I think it's something that's very important for us all not to underestimate, is the power of emotions in learning, and particularly with stress and anxiety, is that, because working memory and executive functioning, it's operating at the highest form of our brain, isn't it? And so that real highest level of cognition, that's the part that just sort of falls away when under stress, because our body's response is to go into a fight, flight, or freeze, isn't it? So we're instantly causing that part of our brain not to be accessed as effortlessly, because biologically we're not meant to. So it's really thinking around, how does anxiety, what does that look like and play into our students' lives, and particularly right now. With everything that's going on in the world and with the changes in being in school and online learning, these are all bits and pieces that will be impacting on everybody's working memory. So it's even more so for pupils or individuals that have difficulties.
And I think also when you think about ADHD, which I can do a whole nother talk on ADHD, but it is a disorder of performance and not a disorder of knowledge. These children have the knowledge. It's about getting that knowledge onto paper. So again, it's about understanding the discrepancies between what they know and how they perform.
Okay, so does working memory capacity differ in different people? So that was one of the questions again. So the answer is yes, it does. And I think that we'll see, from our working memory tests that we even did here, that some of us will have been able to hold on and manipulate those numbers. I myself, not at all. My working memory right now is definitely not working in its most effective way. Studies that were done when the research on working memory really sort of picked up, there's a researcher called Tracy Alloway, Dr. Alloway, and her work is very good. It's very accessible online. We've got a reference to it at the end. And the studies that they did is that they looked at children's academic performance in years 1 or 2, probably through SATs, I imagine. And then what they did was they measured that performance and measured it again in year 6. And so over that time, they noticed that the difference for students that had poor working memory was that there was progress for those children, but the gap just widened completely between those that had strong working memories and those that had weaker working memories. So it meant by year 6, that gap was very big and very different between those who did have those strong working memories and those who didn't in terms of their academic progress. So the research has shown that it's a very good indicator of academic potential, isn't it? Level of working memory. In fact,
working memory is a greater predictor of academic achievement than IQ is. Actually, we don't think about IQ anymore. We really do look at working memory because it does predict academic outcome, which is why it is so important to support these children. And I think one of the questions at the beginning was like, can we increase working memory? Well, working memory capacity does increase with age, but then of course it declines as we get older. And working memory, essentially you think of it as a muscle. If you go to the gym, you are constantly working your muscles, and your bicep, if you're doing bicep curls, will get bigger. If you work your working memory, it will increase. If you stop going to the gym, your muscle will go back to what it was before. If you stop using your working memory, it will go back to what it was before. So essentially, we have to continue to use our working memory in order to make it work. And there are things that we can do. Externalize it. We'll talk about this in a minute, but there are a few other things that we've learned that can help with our working memory capacity, and some of them are to barefoot running. If you barefoot run for about 15 minutes, it increases the blood flow to your prefrontal cortex, and that can help with working memory, and that is instantaneous. Again, some of the essential oils, peppermint, rosemary, we often have them in the office.
I can see my inhaler over there.
To increase our working memory, and that has shown to work. Flavonoids, again, so a diet, although this takes long because you need to build it up within your diet, so things like blueberries and dark chocolate, any excuse. And then we can talk about acetylcholides as well, just to increase those within our neurotransmitters, again, from what we eat and the smells.
So I think there's lots of research, isn't there? And it just continues to grow, because of course it's very much linked to dementia in older age as well. So it's a very relevant area of research. The other thing I think that's really important here that we note is that if you think about having a class of 30 children, that that the working memory capacities are going to be vary greatly within that class. That you will have some students who, let's say age 7 or 8 years old, might have a working memory capacity of a child who is much younger, preschooler, whereas you could also have the opposite, where you've got a child who's 7 or 8 years old but has a working memory capacity of an 11-year-old or of an adult. So it's really important to think about that when you're in your classrooms, and how you might be able to cater and make sort of reasonable adjustments to be able to cater to all of those students.
Okay, so now on to the main crux of what you really need to know as teachers. How do you recognize these difficulties in children? In your class, it might be that child who puts up their hand and then you call on them and they're like, I forgot what I was going to say. That is an absolute classic working memory failure. They can't hold on to what it is that they wanted to say. They can't follow instructions. So if you as a teacher standing at the front and you say, right, first of all, I want you to get out your pen, I want you to turn to page 42, and I want you to answer questions 3, 5, and 9. They just can't follow those instructions. They can't hold that information in their working memory to follow those instructions. So they might do the first one and they might do the middle one, but then they're lost. And then you'll see that they frequently lose place in what they're supposed to be doing. They can't hold in mind that page, those numbers, what it is that they're supposed to be doing. And so they have task abandonment. Again, as Lisa said earlier, once it's gone from working memory, it's gone. You have to start again. It's not like you can go back and find it. So this is why we're going to talk about how we externalize working memory in order for us to help with those memories.
And again, there are many different resources online around working memory, particularly sort of teacher rating scales.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably been published by Tracy Alloway's work as well.
Yeah.
But sort of that concept of green, amber, red. So it really is, it's like a behavioral study, isn't it? And we always like to talk about how we really take the time and invest our time in looking at the data that presents itself with a child in their profile. And it's really, really important for teachers to do the same things in the classroom, is that, just to be aware of what you're looking for, and then note down what types of tasks do you see that behavior in the child. Sometimes you might see what we think is a behavioral, like demonstrative of behavior, but behavior has to manifest from somewhere, doesn't it? And so, you might get, a student who might play up a little bit or be the sort of class clown.
Yeah.
And again, that's an overt description of the behavior, but it could be because it's a task avoidance. Because the working memory is not there. It's difficult for the child, or the daydreaming child, the child who is looking out the window or just really not with it at all. And sometimes you might sort of think, oh, that looks like inattention. All of these things are really, really intertwined. And it's always very important to really kind of pay attention to your students, even spend a week just noting down, what is it that you notice? What are the triggers? And then what are the behaviors? And then what are the consequences? Is that child completely lost the learning and can't get the learning back? So these are all really good indicators. Of course, there's formal ways to recognize, and that's the work that we do through educational assessments, which use formal psychometric testing to do that. But certainly in a classroom, there's plenty that you can do as educators. Okay, so what is the cause of working memory difficulties? So I think that was one of the questions earlier as well. Well, it's not very well understood, is it?
Unfortunately, no.
And actually, I'm thinking back to when the research first started becoming more prominent in the education field and in schools in the 90s. And I remember they used to say that working memory was fixed. And of course, what we've learned over time is that there's, the brains are malleable and there's neuroplasticity. So we know that maybe it's not necessarily about being fixed. It's about having this capacity that, like Lexi said, could be a muscle. It can grow over time. We know for sure, we think we know that it's not strongly related to an individual's background. So it really isn't dependent on socioeconomic status or level of education of parents. It really it hasn't shown that those are variables that determine a working memory. But there is a belief that's likely to be genetic. And one of the ways that we find that out usually is that when we do our conversations and our consultations and interviews with our parents, is that we often say, do you recognize any of these challenges in yourself as a learner? And again, that's a really good way, because often what happens is the parent might say, yes, actually, I found it very difficult learning to read. Or I found it really difficult paying attention in class. I couldn't hold on to the information. And that's even more data for us, isn't it, when we're looking at individual students.
Okay, so how can we support these children with working memory difficulties? First of all, we need to identify, and specifically as well, sometimes as Lisa said, is it a visual working memory issue or is it an auditory working memory issue? And then we need to be mindful and compassionate about that. So we'll go on and show you a few specifics here, but we need to reduce the amount of material that is stored within our working memory. So if we know that a child can only store 3 pieces of information, we really need to think about how we are presenting the salient information of what they need to learn. So it might be that you are shortening the sentences in the way in which you verbalize the instructions and the number of items that child needs to remember. And we'll talk about how we externalize working memory in a second. It might be increasing the meaningfulness. And I've talked about the active dialogue between working memory and long-term memory. Essentially, if we can have new information coming in to our working memory that is completely novel to us, if we can link that to something we already know, from preloading, from understanding different concepts and linking it to a schema we already have, then that knowledge, that germane load is going to be easier to remember. We need to simplify our instructions, don't we? And we're not talking about using simplified words. You can still use the great lexicon in the way in which you describe it, but you are reducing the verbal instructions, that the length of instructions. And I think now that we're going online, teachers do tend to talk an awful lot because you're filling the gap. And sometimes, and particularly my auditory working memory is too much, and Lisa can talk to me and I'm like, I've switched off, I've heard the first part and now I'm glazing over, I can't hear you. So really reduce that amount of information, particularly verbally as well.
Yeah, you know what, I'm just going to check for a second, because I was in a classroom the other day, and it was the teacher had prepared her PowerPoint, and it was really brilliant actually, because what she did was she used just like a flow map. So instead of having a list of instructions on her PowerPoint, she just used a very simple flow map with, you know, a box and an arrow to the next one, and with very, very just salient information that the students needed to know. So the benefit, of course, is for everybody. You know, you don't have to pick away and figure out what it is you need to know. It's just right there. And it wasn't that wasn't the important bits of the lesson. So, you know, being able to differentiate like that helps, doesn't it?
We also do a lot of work, and we understand a lot of differentiation in processing speed and how children process information. Now, those children who can process information really quickly don't have to hold as much information in their working memory. Those children who are slow at processing information have to hold more information within their working memory. So being able to understand processing speed in children really helps us to understand how we can help them and support them within their working memory. We'll talk about memory aids and how we can externalize that and make it concrete. Yeah, let's click on to the next.
Okay, so I think, well, first of all, what we might try to do is, if we can get strategies, because I think we do have many educators online right now, and you have a lot of knowledge and a lot of experience. So if I can put this link into our chat box, it would be really fantastic if you could add to this Jamboard, just ideas that you think would work, or that you're using, or that you think might work in the classroom, now that you've heard a little bit more about working memory and cognitive load. And then we can make a PDF and share this amongst us, so that it's a list that you can create. So let's see if we can get that. So I'm just going to cut and paste that. Okay. Dun, dun, dun. Okay. Great. So if you can have a look at that link that I've just put in for this Jamboard. Okay. Now, I believe that it's the first 16 people to be able to do it.
I think we've got 20 something on.
Yeah, so we'll just see if we can start to add a little bit to our list, but please put on your microphones too if you feel you want to add something, because I can always write a post-it note here. But there's one here: when giving instructions, simplify and give them in chunks. And I really like this one. I saw this in a classroom the other day again, and it was a subject of art. So there was quite a few instructions that needed to be given in order for the task to be successful. But the teacher really managed it very well. She gave the first two, she stopped, she paused, she let some of the processing take place. She gave the next two and then checked in. So that's sort of chaptering. PowerPoints with less words and more pics.
Yeah, cognitive load theory does a lot on how we can reduce the amount of verbalization we have with pictures. It's quite an interesting theory to look at. Provide
visual cues to break learning into clear steps. Yeah, absolutely. And you know, graphic organizers and thinking maps. I don't know if you're familiar with the David Harley thinking maps, but they're brilliant. I recommend looking at them. There are 8 of them, and they represent different types of thinking processes that we need in the classroom. And so again, instead of just you know, putting down in words the information that needs to be known, put it into a map. Okay, any others? Any other ideas?
We can leave this open, collate it as well, can't we?
Yeah. How about the environments that we're in? I wonder if we should think about the type of environment that our students are learning in. Yeah, use students' experience to link to things they are learning. Absolutely.
So we have particular, this goes back to my brains, if I can get it into a
Yes.
conversation. We have different types of long-term memories, those that are semantic about knowledge, but those that are declarative, which is about our own experience. And if we can link information, new knowledge to our own experience, people will obviously have that. Is almost like a preload, you're scaffolding for that.
Yeah, absolutely. More visual aids, more understanding, checking questions.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, being mindful, just again, how much, we might be interjecting during a session, making sure that we've given time for processing of that question before we ask for a response.
And you'll see this, and I digress now, but in children who have slow processing speeds, it's not that they can't get the answer. These children are often actually quite intelligent, but don't pick on that child first. You might come back to them as the last child, because they need to think about the question that you've asked, that you've posed, process that information, get that information out of their long-term memory, and then you can ask them at the end. So if you know your class and know your students, you know who to call on at different times, depending on how fast they process information.
Yeah. Provide visual cues to break learning into clear steps and chunks. Yes, definitely. Yeah, and sometimes, the brain tends to hold on to things that are colorful, as obviously not overwhelmingly colorful, but if you want that salient information in bright yellow, for example, there's lots of different things that you can do that really taps into what we know about how the brain learns. Yeah, ask at Chatteris, we often ask students to chat in pairs. Yes, first, then share the teacher, reduces negative affective factors that students may experience. Yes.
I've actually written a few papers on peer interaction and peer learning. It's quite an interesting concept.
Yes. And talk is very powerful. While we're saying sort of reduce talk, it's more, I suppose what we're thinking is reduce teacher talk in terms of being very, instructive and giving opportunities for that processing to take place. But pupil to pupil and peer to peer talk is very, very beneficial for students. Okay, so should we come back to that question at the end, or do you want to do it now? Yeah.
Yeah, I don't mind. Sorry, just reading your questions down at the side here. They, struggle to express themselves verbally, but they can put it down on paper. Is that what that is?
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. They can't think of the lexical knowledge, and sometimes children with dyslexia will have that that verbal ability. They can explain it to you, but they can't necessarily write it down.
Yes.
Or vice versa. Communicate on paper with a strong gap in their words.
Yeah, and I think also thinking in the context of second language learning, that's where you might see that opposite effect. So you might see putting all of those ideas verbally together. It's down to obviously language acquisition levels, but also it's about that load that's going on for that second language learner, isn't it? There's a lot that they're having to hold on to in order to communicate their ideas. Okay, so well done, everybody. We'll keep that list for you.
Here was some of the examples that we came up with, just to give you an idea. To-do lists. Don't ever think that they are not required. Children need to know what they need to do first, what they need to do second, and what they need to do third. Externalize that working memory. And if that is at the moment with online learning, just one PowerPoint slide at the end, it helps them not have to keep that information within their working memory, and it externalizes it. And the same with timetables, what they have to do now and what they have to do next. And particularly with children who are autistic, they need to know at what time things are happening. Again, use whiteboards, particularly for children as that individual just asked the question on. Get them to throw down all those wonderful wow words, so they don't have to keep in mind what it is or the structure of their written word, so they can concentrate on the spelling and the grammar and everything else. Like whiteboards are really important, or just a jotter, so that they don't have to keep in mind that thought that they have and they put their hand up and they've forgotten it. So whiteboards are a really useful way of externalizing working memory. And again, with the pneumicons, make things concrete, so they understand what it is, model what it is that they have to know and learn, so that they can copy it and scaffold it.
Yeah, and I mean, particularly in maths, remembering that before we get to anything abstract, that's that, you know, problem solving mentally, for example, we've got to do it in the concrete and then the pictorial aspect as well. It's very, very difficult for any concept to be thought about and communicated and learned in the abstract form, which is why we want to externalize
And I think
it
particularly with online learning, you don't have your peer next to you, and you can't just say, oh, what are you doing, what is it that I need to do? You need to be that person that models it. And if that is writing the first sentence, that is something that is structured and concrete that they can copy and model, then that necessarily is what you might need to do. And make information salient, so have these word maps, so that the children who have like shorter working memories and not as sort of powerful neural networks don't have to kind of think in their entire lexicon what wonderful words to use. They can just pick them out of a word map. And I think, again, going back to online learning, think about how many platforms you're using, think about the number of clicks and that extenuous load going back from cognitive load theory.
And I think one last thing too is that we talk about scaffolding by design and, you know, scaffolding spontaneously, and right now we're not in the classrooms to be able to do that, so we have to think about it back in our planning. So, you know, the word maps that Lexi's talking about here, if your teaching objective is about ideation or it's about using similes, then these word maps are tools. They're merely tools. They're not taking away from the child's learning. They're additive. They're supporting that child to be able to do the learning objective that you want them to do. Okay, so just from some of the research, what have teachers observed when they implement working memory friendly strategies in the classroom? Well, this is really great because these are all free. These are no cost, but great benefit strategies that can be used in the classroom. They're just reasonable adjustments that can be made without too much thinking involved. So teachers have seen that there's been improvement in the whole class, not just targeted children, including in their improved concentration, focus, and ability to follow instructions. So again, these will not take away from any kind of learner. This will just add to all learners to be able to support their learning. Children work more independently. If they're working more independently, they are feeling better about themselves as learners. They have raised self-esteem. Once they're trained and understand how to use memory aids, like thinking maps, for example, they tend to start to use those independently because they know that those are crucial to their learning. They've seen improved attention, behavior, and standard of work. And of course, with all of that, you see improved academic progress.
And there is a lot of research that suggests that self-esteem is correlated with academic achievement as well. So increase that self-esteem and you can increase academic output. Okay, very quickly, because I know we need to finish soon. Why working memory is important, and we touched on this earlier. It's a better predictor of academic outcome and performance later, and there was a lot of research on that. So we need to support working memory to support the academic outcome of these children, and we know that even from a very early age the risk of dropout in academics is great. We know that there are a lot of working memory deficits in all children with learning differences and neurodiversity, so we really need to support these children as best we can.
Okay, so because we've just come to the end, so we've left some further reading and some references for you so that you can have a look at. This is a great podcast here by the Education Endowment Fund, and I think that is about it, isn't it?
Yeah. Do we just quickly go and have a look at any questions that we need to ask? We can always email. We've put our emails there. If you've got any questions that you think of, please do get in contact with us. We are here to support us as much as we can.
So we've got lots of, so there's questions about why it's also a symptom of depression too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and that's down to, again, the way our nervous systems are responding, isn't it?
The way in which we ruminate on things.
Yes, and barefoot running. Why barefoot running?
Because it increases the blood flow to our prefrontal cortex. Why you have to be in bare feet, I don't think the science is there, but there's definitely a significant difference between wearing trainers and bare feet.
Yeah. Insight on the effects of phones and technology and the average working memory capacity. Yeah. Well, this is very interesting. I think there are probably lots of studies about that now, but I think that, you know, during Shakespearean times, I read somewhere that they had to hold on to, you know, 15 bits of information. So you can imagine it was such a language, it was such an oracy. So yeah. Okay, well, I think that's it. We do have our emails here. Please do contact us if you have any more questions. This is a whistle-stop tour through cognitive load and working memory, but it's been a pleasure, and we'll give the Chatteris team these Jamboards so that you can have access to them as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah, and do reach out to us if you would like any additional information.